Hello, and welcome to the Riga Security Forum podcast. Today, we are going to be discussing AI as a disruptive technology in the security considerations of Europe. My name is Julia Gifford. I'm the CEO of Truesix and head of comms at 5G Techritory. And today, I am joined by two experts. We have Ijabs, political scientist and member of the European Parliament, and Aldis, head of Emergn Latvia, as well as big data scientist and AI researcher. I thought we would kick off this conversation with a brief intro on the topic itself, as well as a quick introduction from the speakers and your thoughts. In short, we all know that AI's technological development has experienced a massive leap over the past year, and we are forced to consider its implications on all aspects of society, as well as security specifically. And so I would be curious to know, so for example, Ivar, as a political scientist and an MEP, are you seeing the topic of AI and European security being raised? Is this a topic of interest in Brussels?
Yes, this is a topic of a huge interest, but of course, well, I'm a politician and a decision maker, and that's why, we are usually trying to set some legal framework for what is happening in the technological sphere. I'm not an engineer, and that's why I think that I would be really benefiting from this dialogue with Aldis, who is really an expert in the tech part of the story. The policy part of the story is that, of course, we are lagging behind in terms of technological developments with our regulations, because we all know that what's happening right now, especially after the ChatGPT appeared last winter. There has been a lot of new applications and not a lot of new technologies coming in. And Europe, and the European Union in particular, is trying to set those technologies in some kind of a value-based framework to make it more predictable, more secure in many aspects. There are quite a few interesting aspects which could be covered in the context of security, starting with cybersecurity and the possibilities for cryptography in AI, but also, in terms of politics, we are all expecting certain use of AI in the next year's electoral campaigns, because the next year, 2024, is a big election year, both in Europe and in the US. Which means that all those deepfake technologies and things like that might be coming into the game, and this has already happened. And in that sense, of course, policymakers have to stay in touch with technology and listen to technology experts. At the same time, of course, this is what we are for, in a sense that, politicians have to put technological developments in a certain framework which would make those technologies sure for our citizens. Thank you. Back to you.
Yeah, thank you. So it sounds like we have a lot of concerns that all require some sort of regulation, and that will be a big topic that we will certainly touch on in this discussion. But you mentioned that it's important to listen to the technology experts. So Aldi, a question for you. As an academic and a practical specialist, is security a topic that you've thought about, and what seems most important and most pressing from your perspective?
Yeah, maybe short remark. When we're talking about the security topic, we see that in industry, we see that there will be much bigger impact from the quantum computing, which is also coming, but quantum computing will change security for forever, let's say. The levels of cryptography, etc. But when we talk about AI, we must understand that AI actually is some tiny area of advanced analytics, or we are using, like, AI is responsible for the imitation of human senses, like vision, that we can see the pictures, picture generation, reading, text comprehension, translation, voice synthesis, and stuff like that. And in this sense, of course, with OpenAI and all the developments of large language models, we have ChatGPT, and now recently, just last Friday, Google released their platform Gemini for that. Of course, we need to talk about more how to regulate it, and how to actually we can deal with different security issues using it, because what we see that it's actually the AI is as good as the training data is. And of course, we see many origins of training data. And what's in industry we are discussing, the larger training data corpus is in China. Like you could have a biometrical data, like for face recognition, for example, for emotion recognition, etc. And the question is how we will protect our data, because some of the data used for AI is not just text for ChatGPT, but actually capturing every day from the surveillance cameras. And the question is how we could later use this data, because me personally, I'm suffering from these scams when someone is calling you and saying, here we're calling from police or bank, and getting short messages from like post and everywhere. So imagine that we will have generated images or videos that will look like real.
Yeah, the scammers are very skilled, and with technology like AI in their hands, we certainly have to become more aware and more able to deal with that. And you bring up an excellent topic about how the data, our own personal data, is very sensitive and vulnerable in these senses. And just recently, we would be remiss if we didn't discuss the EU AI Act, which has been under intense discussion and debate in the European Union at the moment, which is meant to be the first major regulative legislation regulating AI. And when it was created back in 2021, then we didn't have LLMs as prevalent as we did now. And now that we do, these regulations have had to be amended. And all of these conversations and discussions have been around the fact that if we regulate too much, are we stifling innovation? And so my question for Ivars would be, is it possible to get this balance right? Is it possible to maintain innovativeness while also maintaining the security checks? And how are you seeing it from the European perspective?
Well, the general approach of the European Union is that we strongly feel that we are lagging behind in those disruptive technologies, both from the US, but also from China. And that's why, of course, well, also fostering innovation in this field is pretty important. But, well, the EU has always been very strong on regulation, not on fostering, but on regulation. And that's why, of course, the current AI Act is mainly about regulation. It is, as we call it, the risk-based approach, that there are certain technologies that are being banned, like, well, the biggest fight has been over real-time biometric recognition, predictive policing, things like that have been banned. But also there are the concept of high-risk applications like AI in transport, AI in education, AI in energy, and so on and so forth. And then there are, let's say, much less risky issues that have been, well, mentioned in that regulation. I think that, well, the AI Act, which was, by the way, the preliminary political agreement between the Parliament and the Council has been reached just yesterday, which means that we will have it. We will have it in this parliamentary mandate, because right now the biggest fear in the EU is that if we do not adopt something until, let's say, March or April of the next years, and it's not going to be adopted in this Parliament, it's not going to be adopted with this European Commission, which makes things more difficult, but most probably we are going to have it, which is good. As far as I understand, this is, again, a compromise, as most legislation adopted by the European Union. And but again, this is one of those things where, well, our tech experts tend to be rather skeptical about many of those things, and they are saying that, well, you are trying to regulate the AI of yesterday and not the AI of tomorrow. Because, for example, when those large language models came in on a mass scale last year, of course, it made all the legislation to be rewritten. Because, well, there are also this story about generative AI, about foundational models. It all had to be introduced in the text. And as far as I understand, the last developments is that there are some German and French companies that are dealing and working with those large language models, and they are not very happy about the very restrictive approach chosen by the EU. So, this is just the start of the game, because when you have the legislative act, then the next step is, of course, the implementation. How do you implement that? And this is always the most tricky thing, especially when dealing with issues like data, which was just mentioned by my honorable counterpart. Well, we all know how the GDPR works, in a sense that, countries have different interpretations, different restrictions, and it's moving forward very slowly. I think with the AI Act, it's going to be the same. Thank you.
Yes. Yes, you mentioned that European companies also in the LLM space, Mistral AI, Alpha, but the really big ones are outside of Europe. They're not EU based. So my question, Aldis, is this something that we should be concerned about, that the really major LLMs aren't here? And are we truly falling back on a global scale? Should we be concerned?
Yeah, this is an actual situation that we see that these investments, large investments in AI are made by large companies in the United States. So we know them in almost in Silicon Valley and in Microsoft. And in China, it's more governmental initiatives in AI. So, and it's because historically also because of this large big data available, it's where the big data collected, and it's logical because currently there are some beneficiaries from AI, and these beneficiaries are actually large companies. Like, imagine the Google, if they implement something and add to the search engine, so it's influences billions of users, or Meta or Microsoft, if they do implement something, so it's they can spend very large amounts of R&D resources and invest in this. And China do the same, and they have availability of data. So in this sense, it makes sense. So it's very logical. And me personally, I'm not so concerned about the regulations we have in Europe. I think we should be strict at the beginning, and then see how it develops. One thing that in industry, across experts, there are most discussions about the OpenAI and ChatGPT and all these large language models. The industry thinking that it should become an open source, and that changes it dramatically, because when it owned by some giant from China or from US, it's closed, and we don't know exactly for what it trained, what training data use it, how to use it, and etc. And it's also very hard to regulate it. And when it becomes open source, which makes actually sense, even from the humanity point of view, because in future we will have few large language models, not many. So that because to produce and train them and maintain them, it takes so much energy. Actually, experts think that to own large language model for each company, there is no energy on the planet to train them. So we will have a few of them, and it makes sense to agree to have some open source model that which will Europe will benefit the most from this open source model.
Well, thank you. That's a very interesting consideration. A general push for open source LLMs and AI. In the meantime, us being here in Europe and Latvia, we have a language that's spoken by just a few million people. How does this impact our security as people who speak this very specific language, maybe also for other people from other small nations with their own unique languages? I guess that's a question for... Yeah, go ahead.
Well, as far as I understand, as far as I understand, well, this is a problem, especially for Latvia. At least my colleagues from the University of Latvia, from the Institute of Mathematics and Informatics, they told me that, well, there are, of course, quite a huge amount of data, but it's still very much copyright protected. And well, it's not open source. It's mainly owned by the National Library of Latvia, and there is still an ongoing negotiation whether they can be used to train the AI models. And I think in that sense, of course, this is a challenge because, I mean, Latvian language AI shouldn't be lagging behind the English or whatever, German, French, and so on and so forth. Well, in that sense, I think that we should, well, make a reasonable decision about the availability of Latvian language corpus, because as far as I understand from the experts, it's still very much so that, well, for example, the ChatGPT can write a poem, a very decent poem in English. But when you ask it to write a decent poem in Latvian, it's still not capable of doing that because it hasn't been trained, which means that we should protect that multilingualism. As far as I understand, the US approach to this particular question, to the IP rights, is slightly different from the European, because the US has this fair use principle, which means that, well, if your usage of a certain amount of data doesn't prevent the owner of the IP rights to benefit from the product, then it's fine for you to use it. In Europe, the approach is, as far as I understand, much more restrictive in a sense that you just can't use the IP protected data without permission to train your AI models. Thank you.
So if we
maybe
want
from
AI...
technical point.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
From technical point of view, of course, small corpuses of text of languages, that it's a, let's say, problem of all European Union countries, not just Latvia and many other countries, of course. But if we look at Europe, of course, we are speaking many languages. We are not like US. In China, it's a different situation. It's not also one language, let's say, but it gives us some opportunity probably to not being be a little bit protected in same time, but also we are like not getting all the possibilities of these large language models. And I see here pluses and minuses. The plus is that we don't know still how how it will help us to increase productivity, because that is what we are looking for. And for sure, from my experience, all the AI solutions are working best in business, not for these large giants, because for large technology giants, we see they are working in their application, in portals, search engines, etc. But if you talk about the companies, enterprises, so it will work together with human. So there will be cooperation when human is using AI and being more productive. And we still don't see so much use cases of it. We are waiting for it. And probably it's time to also prepare for us prepare these language models and maybe language corpuses and be ready for that. So I think we still have time.
It does seem to be a trade-off. From one perspective, yes, with more availability of our languages in AI, we can do more with the tool. At the same time, Aldis, do you think that this maybe limitedness of the language helps us, for example, in the personal scamming aspects of what we're seeing and how we're seeing LLMs being used?
Absolutely, absolutely. And we see, for example, we know that having 30 hours of our voices, for example, your voice, you could generate your synthetic voice, and like limiting information available about us on internet, and also because let's say we are separate unique language, of course, from the security reasons. And here I am maybe speaking, we need to touch two aspects. One is an internal security, right? All these scams and etc. In this sense, I think we will benefit as Latvia, because there will be, it will be very hard to generate something quite good with these models. And another thing, of course, we need to think and talk probably also on regulatory level is about dual use of this technology, because for sure it will be used for military and some, again, internal security needs on both sides, like on the government side and another government, let's say.
Ivars, do you have any thoughts on the dual use of AI, especially from a politician's perspective?
Well, first of all, the EU has reasonably enough left the military use of the AI out of the scope of the AI Act. Because, of course, there are quite a few, sensitive issues about the killer robots and drones and so on and so forth, machine vision and things like that. But we haven't been dealing with that because, especially in the light of the Russian aggression in Ukraine, I think that the EU shouldn't try to regulate this particular field, at least now, and we should have probably a broader scope, not just the EU Act, but talking with our transatlantic partners and so on and so forth. But as for different kinds of hybrid applications, scamming, deepfakes, and so on and so forth, I hope that Mr. Erglis is right in saying that Latvians, because of the very limitations of the language, would be, less exposed to those threats, because, of course, they are very real. In many ways, starting with the fact that, we can just fantasize about, let's say, a robot being capable of calling my grandmother, for example, asking to transfer some money to my account or something like that, but also, of course, different kinds of political manipulation. You might remember the recent story about the Slovak elections when, there was kind of deep fake conversations in audio, not in video, being publicized by the opposition leader, who happens to be a good friend of mine in the European Parliament, and he was seemingly speaking about raising the prices of beer in country like Slovakia. This must be a very, very important topic. And they lost the election. It's of course a question whether that was because of that deepfake, but it might not be the case. But nevertheless, I mean, and just as I said, the next year is the election year, not just in the US and the EU, but also in India, for example, and in places like that, which means that we have to be careful. And that's why, of course, the AI legislation is just the part of that story, because, there are also other parts of the EU's digital legislation. I'm talking primarily about the Digital Services Act, how those platforms where those deepfakes are being exposed, how they are obliged, first of all, to fight preventively such uses and to take them off when they appear. But nevertheless, this is a real danger. Just imagine, whatever person coming out and saying something that they, be it Joe Biden, be it Donald Trump, be it, Vladimir Putin or whomever you want, just coming out and saying something about, what they haven't said ever. So, this is a real thing. Thank you.
Certainly. And with these deep fakes and scams and whatnot, it seems that it is equally becoming a security issue to teach the everyday individual to become vigilant and recognize these. Do you have, either of you, a vision of what that might look like? How do we go about developing this knowledge, this vigilance, so that we can protect ourselves as a society and our grandmothers and parents and neighbors against falling victim to something that seems very real?
Yeah, if I may, I think two things. Let's say, if we get back a little bit to this dual use, we have a very strict regulation on the dual use when we talk about chemicals and different goods, like for import, export, and producing. I think we also need to apply something for the data that could be used for dual use. Imagine that some service who is collecting biometrical data that could be possibly like exported and then used by another country. So it should be all these strategic data sets, let's say, should be somehow regulated. On the other side, I think we should have a very active discussion in society, and I imagine that it could be ideally led by government, by public sector, about how to deal with that. What is as a humans, what should be our attitude to all this stuff? And for me, I think it's very helpful if you can read in portals that there is a new scam available. So be aware of it. So it helps enormously. And this is something we need to speak more about it and actually educate society about these things.
Mm-hmm. And Ivar, do you want to round this discussion out with a comment from your side?
Well, I completely agree with the statement that education and, speaking openly about the threats and also opportunities of the AI is a crucial issue, because, again, we want to regulate and we have to regulate, because this is also our, let's say, political and public responsibility to have certain regulation of this, technological revolution happening right now. At the same time, we shouldn't also forget to talk about opportunities, because in terms of productivity, for example, which is, by the way, an issue for Latvia in particular, this is also a huge opportunity which should be used. And in that sense, I think that, to have a balanced debate, because, we have another example. by the way, which is still a very hot topic in the European institutions. This is a ban of GMO. Well, do we want, in the worst scenario, this technological revolution of AI following the path of the GMO, which was just banned because of real or perceived risks? I think that we shouldn't, of course, leave the AI developments in a completely anarchical process where everything goes. But on the other hand, we should be also aware of the fact that there is a risk also of banning too much and stifling the technological progress, which could be very beneficial for the European economy, because of course we don't have such big data sets and big tech companies that the US have, but we have a lot of good brains in the EU, which could be helpful in order to foster the European economic development. So in that sense, I think that we should talk both about risks and of opportunities, which is important, not just talking about risks, because then it turns into scaremongering, which is, to my mind, also not very productive. Thank you.
Thank you very much. With that, we have to conclude our conversation. So I want to say thank you very much to our experts, Ivars, Ijabs, and Aldis Erglis, for joining us in our discussion on AI as a disruptive technology in the security considerations of Europe. Thank you very much for joining us. And make sure to follow the podcast, take a look at other episodes. They're available on the Riga Security Forum website, Spotify, Apple Podcast. So make sure to check those out, and we'll see you next time.